Hello and welcome to Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University. I am Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of the election law program here at OSU. And today we are delighted to be joined by Joshua Sellers, who is a professor of law at the University of Texas, along with our regulars, Ned Foley, the Director of Election Law at OSU, and Terry Enns and Tony Goggin, some of the senior fellows of our election law program. And today, as we've done in several recent podcasts, we're focusing our conversation around a symposium that the Law Journal here at The Ohio State University hosted just a week ago. That symposium was addressing a new book that Harvard Law professor Nick Stephanopoulos has just recently published called Aligning Election Law. The symposium gave us a chance to talk about a number of dimensions of Nick's book, with Nick here as a keynote speaker, but with also three different panels of three legal scholars or political scientists talking about the idea of aligning our election law institutions or our democratic institutions with the wishes of the broader American electorate. Joshua was one of the panelists at that event. And so today we're going to be able to continue to reflect on some of the topics that came up at the symposium, which I will just say by way of brief reflection was a really stimulating event. And we're happy to be able to say that a recording of that symposium is now available. It comes in pieces. You can look at each of the individual panels. And you can also take a look at the keynote address that Nick Stephanopoulos presented at that symposium. You can find those recording links also on the homepage of this podcast, as well as on the homepage of the Election Law at Ohio State program. So with that, we're ready to continue our conversation, and I'll let Tony queue up a first question for us.
Sure. Joshua, could you begin by discussing the paper you presented at this symposium and providing an overview of the argument that you made?
Sure, yeah. And first, let me just say it's great to see you all again. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you as well for the invitation to Ohio State. I had not been to Columbus for a long time. And I agree, it was a great event. And I think Nick's book, is really exceptional and warranted that kind of treatment. So I was happy to participate. So Nick's book, he's endorsing this idea of alignment across democracy and across election law as a field. And, he goes to great lengths to sort of articulate and define different dimensions of alignment and talks about the idea of sort of collective alignment, jurisdiction-wide alignment, being the sort of overriding aspiration. And, the book is sort of, it's appropriately sort of modest about some of the limitations of alignment, achieving it. Of course, Nick says, we're not anywhere close to alignment at the present, but again, he wants to use it as an aspiration. And he also talks about, in one chapter specifically, political parties and the relationship between alignment of political parties and alignment of the electorate more broadly. So in other words, how should we think about the relationship between intra-party alignment, the average sort of member of a party or the median a voter in a party, aligning their views with their elected officials? We can think about that sort of intra-party alignment on the one hand, and then what's the relationship between that type of alignment and national alignment that Nick is aspiring for. And Nick is, to my mind, a little bit dismissive of that relationship and sort of saying, there's no relationship of democratic importance between intra-party alignment and collective alignment. And in fact, Nick has said, intra-party alignment is a threat often to collective alignment. And so that gave me pause when I read the book, and I sort of, wanted to probe that a bit. So I brought that up on the panel last week. And I think there are maybe some more interesting, intriguing relationships between intra-party alignment and collective alignment. And I gave an example drawing from a 10th Circuit case, Cox versus Republican Party of Utah, to sort of give an example of how I think intra-party alignment in some circumstances might be able to facilitate collective alignment. So that was sort of one point I made. The other point I made was following on something that Professor Michael Kang said on an earlier panel, which was, hyper-partisanship is such now that anytime we're thinking about alignment, whether it's intra-party, whether it's collective alignment, tribalism and partisanship is necessarily going to be part of the story. And so one observation I made is that if you ask, I think, the average voter today whether they would sacrifice some degree of alignment, in other words, would they be okay with their elected officials not actually pursuing policies that would benefit them? Would they sacrifice some degree of alignment in exchange for their side winning? And unfortunately, I think the answer is probably yes. And I think a large percentage of the electorate would actually just say, I just want my team to win. I just want my side to win, even if the elected officials aren't actually pursuing that many policies that I think will benefit me. And I think, one thing we didn't get into in the panel last week was, what explains that? And one theory I think is just the fear and anxiety about the other side is so high that I think, the degree of alignment people would sacrifice is also probably quite high.
Can I push you or ask you a little bit about that with respect to a very purple state that's razor thin 50-50, but polarized? I'm thinking of Arizona, where I know you were for a number of years before being in Texas, which is right on the knife's edge, but it's not that everybody's clumped in the middle. They're out there. Not everybody's out at the extremes, but polarization means more people are towards the opposite ends of each side. And yes, I can imagine everybody wanting to win for their side, but in a knife's edge state, there's the risk that the other side's going to win. So I wonder, if we ask voters, would you rather have an electoral system where half the time you'll win, roughly speaking, in a 50-50 purple state, and get policies you really like, but the other half of the time, the opposite side's going to win, having policies you really hate? Versus, so that's kind of our current system, I think, causing that. The alternative system would be kind of a system that finds a candidate towards the middle that neither side loves, but is more of a compromise. And again, I think Arizona is a good example of this. In the last Senate election of Arizona, the incumbent Senator Kyrsten Sinema didn't run after she was threatened with a primary challenge from the progressive left within the Democratic Party, and she converted herself into an independent after she had made the left mad and had done some deals with Republicans in the Senate. And whatever you think about her, she was clearly, trying to position herself in the middle. And so she dropped out, and the race ended up being a progressive Democrat named Ruben Gallego and a really very far-right MAGA Republican, Carrie Lake, who was one of the leading election denialists. Now, the Democrat happened to win the election, but I think it's fair to say Arizona could go either way. Would most voters in Arizona say, I'd rather want the chance, and these are Lake voters or Gallego votes, I'd rather have my candidate having a chance of winning, even though I might risk the other extreme winning, but as opposed to, can we meet in the middle over somebody like Sinema and not get half a loaf, but not risking either zero of the loaf or the whole loaf? Do you understand what I'm at?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, so Arizona, it's interesting because Arizona it was often said there, 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democratic, 1/3 independent. So it's not quite you described it as being, sort of split right and left. It's a little more complicated than that. And I think that 1/3 of the electorate that's independent often is, their preferences are often dispositive. As you said, I think the Republican Party has been nominating, some fringe candidates out there lately, whether Lake or others who were at least in the conversation for some time, people like Blake Masters. They're not appealing, right, to that third in the middle, by and large. But I think the broader point you're getting at, something else that came up at the conference is, what's the relationship between alignment and competition? Because what I hear you endorsing is a competitive system, one that does reflect our national politics. Very, very tight elections can go either way. Your incentives are to try to do whatever it takes to win, because you get so much, right? The spoils are so great just from achieving victory, and you have a good chance of winning, right? That's obviously Rick Pildes, who was at the conference, has been, advocating for competition to sort of be the overriding value in election law for many decades. And it was interesting to hear the conversations at the event about what is the actual relationship between competition and alignment. I mean, Nick does a good job in the book, I think, of saying they're distinct concepts, and you can have a very competitive system that's very misaligning ultimately. And I think you would describe the president in that way, right? You win everything, you take everything, therefore you can sort of jam through whatever you want. But there is that possibility that you might lose everything in 2 years' time or 4 years' time. I can see why Nick is a little uncomfortable with that as the North Star, because in many cases, and again, I think in the present environment, it has proven to be quite misaligning.
Joshua, can I ask for your perspective on what you identified as this potential public preference for having their side win rather than an aligned system, and whether that, or what that says about the public's support of democracy? Does it say anything about what it means to have a democracy and what citizens think that means?
I think it potentially says a lot about democratic legitimacy, and what we're sort of seeking in structuring our elections in a particular way, what our expectations are for participation rates, what makes an election legitimate. And again, to go back to the book, thought one of the more interesting findings Nick has in the book, and I'd love to hear Ned's opinion on this, is that non-voters, were they to participate, wouldn't necessarily change outcomes all that much. This is, again, Nick quoting some empirical findings to say that, but for the most part, the active electorate, let's call it, reflects public preferences. If we added a bunch of new voters, it wouldn't necessarily alter public preferences all that much. That was surprising to me, as someone who, has been involved with trying to increase voter registration rates, and thinks that there is sort of these untapped segments of the electorate that may have different preferences. Now, I don't know necessarily what the preferences would be, but I was surprised again to have Nick say that it wouldn't necessarily actually change preferences all that much. So that speaks to questions of democratic legitimacy. And related problem that you're getting at, Steve, is what do we do with preferences that are insidious in some ways, right? Nick sort of says, well, if people favor illegal things or unconstitutional things, we can disregard that. But short of that line, right, it was a little unclear to me what else we might exclude, right? Sort of just calling some preferences invidious or beyond the pale or anti-democratic, I think just raises harder questions about to what extent do we credit people's judgments and views, particularly at a time when the system is at risk, right? And our institutions are at risk, and we shouldn't necessarily be comfortable with people who are sort of anti-system, anti-social in that way. But it's hard to find a legitimate justification in a democracy for excluding those preferences outright.
I happened to attend a conference here at Princeton that happened since the great symposium that we were all at Ohio State. And this was more sort of political philosophy and democratic theory. And one topic that really came up there among those circles is the idea of sortition, which is a fancy word of saying that we should choose our democratic representatives the way we select juries. In other words, rather than having elections where candidates try to appeal for votes, we should create representative assemblies, legislatures, populated by citizens who are drawn by lot from the body politic. Ancient Greece, democracy in ancient Greece was more on that model than our electoral model. And I wish I could have put the two events together in the way, because I think it's probably true that a lottery system of populating our legislatures, in theory, should be perfectly aligning, right? In other words, if the members of the legislature are, fully representative of the cross section of the electorate from which they come, you avoid the empirical issue, Joshua, that you were talking about turnout effects of having a skewing or a misaligning thing. I mean, it's just you guarantee representativeness through random sampling. Or as close to it as I guess as possible. But there was a lot of pushback at the conference from another camp of democratic theorists saying that to be represented by random selection is not the volitional nature of democracy. To those folks, requires an exercise of the will of the people making choices. And so even if a lottery was perfectly aligning or representative, it would eliminate the volitional nature of self-government. I'm curious whether you or any of us have thoughts about that in terms of the values that we're trying to achieve in a democracy.
Well, you at the conference, Ned, we spoke about this after your session. I suspect you're sympathetic with the latter approach, based on what you said at the Ohio State event, because that was the sort of strongest endorsement I'd heard you make about, I guess, what you're calling the sort of volitional aspect of participation. Why are you devoting so much attention to talking about alternate electoral structures, right, and the process by which we aggregate votes and stuff? Part of the reason I heard you articulate is that individuals, right, those of us in the electorate need to have faith in the system and believe that the system is sort of designed in a way that's going to produce the best outcome for us, but also sort of best reflect our judgments and our desires. The current system is not doing that. The sort of two-party duopoly, first past the post system, for many reasons, is not achieving that. But you were saying that has independent value. Putting alignment to the side, right? Whatever downstream democratic effects result, the process itself has democratic value, and people need to be made aware of that and buy into it. So I'm hearing correspondence between what you said and the latter view you just articulated, which sounds like, so this is to say, I had not given a lot of independent thought to that myself, but I think it's an important sort of step in the conversation to sort of make the case for why, the process itself, even if it produces anti-democratic or liberal outcomes, we can fight against those in other ways, but the process itself also has to be legitimate.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, yeah.
Joshua, you said that fear is one of the potential drivers that even goes over and beyond, alignment with your party allegiances, etc. And I'm just wondering whether we're not focused on a rational actor, but the actors that we're talking about, self included, act irrationally all the time, especially when voting. And I just wonder if you have any comment about that, because, this conversation between you and Ned, it's like you're talking about very rational people. And I'm not sure that's really who's, including, like I said, I'll put myself in the camp. I'm not sure I'm acting all that rationally when I'm voting.
I mean, all of these are really challenging, profound questions of democratic theory and legitimacy. I mean, what your question calls to mind is, I want to say it was maybe public choice literature introduced the idea of the public ignorance objection. I think that's what it was called for a time, just the idea that most members of the voting public are very poorly informed on issues of public policy. And so therefore, what does that tell us about democratic legitimacy if most people participating are not, Terry, the rational actor who's, looked through the voting guides and, thoroughly assessed and compared the candidates on every issue? I think, again, it's a question of scale. And, I keep bringing up the book, but the book is so, Nick's book, it's so full of information that's relevant here. He says, look, there are going to be invidious views, there's going to be ignorant views that people have, but if you look across people's issue sets, you can come up with, this is getting into political science stuff, but a sort of ideological score that generally reflects their approach to sort of a suite of issues. And that will give a good assessment, a pretty accurate assessment of how they feel about things, even if they can't necessarily articulate a rational view on every individual item in the suite of issues or something. I think there's truth in that. And I also think that even putting that aside, I think we should and do appropriately credit people's views and judgments, even if they are misguided. Now, there's an educational aspect to this. There's a sort of messaging aspect to this. The media plays obviously an enormous role in this. Misinformation, disinformation is rampant. But I don't see any reason to sort of discard wholesale people's judgments just because, we think that they're based in ignorance or people are ill-informed. They're based in something that people are experiencing. I think that should be our focus.
Joshua, on the topic of democratic legitimacy, one of the unique features of the American election system is that we have partisan election administration. And that feature of our system has long been criticized by scholars. But I wonder whether you think that if we had neutral election administration, such as in Canada with Elections Canada, with nonpartisan administration of at least our federal elections, would that solve the democratic legitimacy problem? Or in terms of the public's distrust, the outcomes when their party loses? I wonder, in the context of the observation you made about hyper-partisanship's implications for aligning election law, whether hyper-partisanship also poses a challenge to the assumption that neutral election administration would eliminate concerns about democratic legitimacy.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what we know from comparative studies is that, sort of technocratic, nonpartisan election management bodies serve an incredibly important role and can help. But the studies that make those findings obviously are mostly focused on countries unlike ours that is so decentralized. So there's a fundamental difference between our approach and obviously what Elections Canada is doing. And their sort of ambit is much broader. I mean, an organization like that does so many things. I've written about the efforts that Elections Canada and other organizations like that in Australia and elsewhere take to get voters registered. I mean, it's a very affirmative approach to, going to communities to try to get people registered. We don't have anything like that. That work gets outsourced here. But to the heart of your question, I mean, I think it can help. And I think that it could help to foster trust in institutions and not seeing them as partisan bodies. But that also goes to educating the public and sort of messaging and all the things I was just talking about. And I'll also say it's interesting work on, I've seen some studies about comparing nonpartisan election administration and partisan election administration. Partisan election administration, not necessarily a bad thing. What turns out to matter is having partisans of, the rules established well in advance, partisans of both, from both parties in the room, right? That can actually lend credibility to have the sort of co-partisan election administration. There's no obvious distinction between, it's not to say nonpartisan necessarily better, or, having partisans in the room is necessarily bad. It's more about the professionalism, right? Sort of training the professionalism and having rules of the game established ex ante that turns out to sort of matter the most. So whether it's partisan or nonpartisan, I'm in line with many others who just say we just should be devoting more resources to election administration, and also doing what some states do, which is having, ongoing training programs, certification programs, things like that, to try to elevate election administration across the board.
Joshua, I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about the particular subject of your paper from last week, and talking about the idea of alignment or not of the party leadership with its members, the intra-party stuff. I know that we sometimes have been talking in spaces like this about how polarization arguably has been driven by the way in which the two major political parties have increasingly relied on primary elections to generate their candidates, with the idea being, or the argument being, that those primary elections have meant that the party leaders have lost some degree of control in a way that pushes people to the extremes. But, the Utah case that you reference is a really interesting case study in the way in which Utah still has this hybrid system involving parties and a party convention. And it's not clear that the party convention in Utah is less polarizing as opposed to more polarizing in the current moment. So anyway, I just put that out there as an opportunity and an invitation for you to say a little bit more about what you think the role of alignment or not within a party or within the two major parties is or is not contributing to broader polarization at the moment.
Yeah, another great question. I think it really depends on what dimension or component of the party you're looking at. And so to sort of state the obvious, it's difficult to even define parties in the first place, right? There was the old view, let's say mid-20th century view, there was a sort of narrow conception of parties. They were top down. They did have deeper roots into state and local sort of auxiliaries, but largely what you're referring to was the sort of peer review, right, that went into the selection of presidential candidates. Primary elections were not binding throughout much of the century. That all came post 1968. So there was a narrower conception of the party. We now have an extremely broad conception of the party, right? Because we've had to bring in super PACs, think tanks, nonprofits, activist groups. All of these other entities comprise what a lot of scholars refer to as the shadow party. Media organizations, are they part of the party, right? So there's these very difficult sort of definitional questions that scholars do not have consensus on. So you have that issue, and then you have the question you're getting at, which is, how can we think about alignment within a party when we have this first order definitional question? So it gets tricky very quickly. I'm a bit old school on this. I mean, I do think we need to sort of reconstitute the parties in some ways, but not in all ways. I think prevailing wisdom now is that parties are these nebulous organizations. They don't have the deep roots they once had. There was a great book that came out last year, The Hollow Parties, that got a lot of attention from two political scientists. So that's the sort of prevailing wisdom at the time. Currently working on a piece, not rebutting that thesis, but just trying to supplement it a bit. And look at ways in which parties actually are quite strong. And so trying to consider, how are parties strong, how are parties weak, and to what extent does that binary actually confuse things? So this is all just background to say, I think we need clarity on those issues before we can think about intra-party alignment, but I tend to favor the narrower conception that excludes, sort of media organizations, think tanks, any entity that sort of isn't responsible to the electorate directly, doesn't stage elections. I think if I'm thinking about intra-party alignment, I think I'm inclined to exclude entities like that. But others might have a different view and say, no, the role that those entities are playing is so central and crucial that you have to sort of consider them. And in fact, in many instances, they're driving the polarization you're talking about. So if we're talking about polarization, I think you can't reasonably exclude them, but just for defining intra-party alignment, my inclination would be to take a narrower definition of parties.
Can I follow up with which I think it's a related question? I'd love to hear you opine on a problem that is really vexing me, which is I'm surprised at how sticky or the opposite of resilient our system is in some respects. And just as an observer of political competition, we're talking about political competition, I'm baffled by the degree to which I think that the Democratic Party has specifically become uncompetitive statewide in a lot of states. Ohio has become out of reach to the Democrats in statewide elections in a way that wasn't true certainly 20 years ago, maybe not even 10 years ago. And I'm thinking other states, Missouri, Iowa, have gone this way. In Indiana, it's at the same time, our country is 50-50, and states like Arizona is 50-50. There are probably states where being a Republican just is a non-starter. But I was really surprised that in the Nebraska Senate race last year, it was more important to be an independent challenging a Republican than to be a Democrat. Now, the independent didn't win, but did better than what a Democrat would have done. And I don't think our system can be healthy unless the parties are nimble enough. They don't have to be national monoliths, right? The Democratic Party in Ohio doesn't have to be the same as the Democratic Party in Massachusetts or Vermont. And you're in Texas now. I'm curious as to, people have talked about the Texas turning blue, demographically or whatever, and that just doesn't seem to capture the reality of the brand and what the state. Obviously, there's pockets of Democratic competitiveness in Texas, but it feels statewide that it's getting further out of reach as opposed to closer. And do you have any views on the kind of sociology that is causing this brittleness, and what, if anything, that can be done about it?
I think you're right to refer to party brands. I mean, that's what they are to some extent. And, we've all read about the sort of nationalization of politics. So even in local elections, people are voting on national issues because they think that, that parties are sort of these monoliths. I guess my thoughts are what's been lost, the party theorists say, is deep-seated community connections, state and local connections. In the mid-20th century, parties played an active role in people's civic lives. And that, I think, has been lost. I think the Hollow Parties authors are right about that. That has largely been lost in much of the country, which explains why I think, that there aren't sort of emergence of candidates, right? In some of these places you're talking about, there isn't brand building, and there isn't sort of recognition of what the party can offer to a community, through people from that community, messages coming from people integrated in those communities, right? If you're only getting national messages, of course, right, you think things are, different than what they actually are because you're only seeing, right, this narrative that's being pushed from, name your cable channel or name your national paper. So the party theorists say, look, we need to be more rooted in communities. We need to make people see the party as sort of a tool, right, that they can use to their advantage to benefit them. Now, achieving that, I think, is very challenging. I mean, there's a financial dimension, of course. I think there's efforts that the national leadership could take to more greatly empower state and local parties to try to build out these the infrastructure. But when we talk about this kind of thing, it seems like, almost a generational task. But I'm dismayed as well, looking at sort of the map and looking at the absence of competition, looking at, the few states which are meaningfully competitive. I mean, I guess we could say those states have changed throughout the past 20 years in interesting ways, but it's still only a handful of states. So I think I associate this with just the labor, right, that has to be done to build up parties and connect them with communities.
I wonder about the role of class in all of this, and that we are living through this extraordinary class realignment of the two parties. I think Donald Trump was the first Republican to ever lose a majority of college-educated voters, and over the last decade, we've seen college-educated voters coalesce in the Democratic Party. Conversely, Donald Trump's winning a larger share of, and Republicans in general, Republican congressional candidates are winning a larger share of working class voters than in all likelihood the Republican Party ever has, having historically been the Chamber of Commerce party, the big business party. The two parties in some ways have traded their bases, and that's happening against the backdrop of really interesting demographic change, with people self-selecting, upper middle class college graduates choosing to live on the coast or in Chicago or in big cities, that seems to have exacerbated then this problem that Ned is talking about, where the divide now is not just a divide between people within a particular state, but because it's so nationalized, the polarization is really driving where people choose to live, which then makes red state, even in a 50-50 nation, it makes red states redder, and at a certain level makes blue states bluer. And I wonder, in particular, Texas, Joshua, where you are, the New York Times has an extraordinary, of the last 3 elections, they have this extraordinary map that shows, I think it's called an extremely detailed map of the 2024 election, 2020, 2016. They also show trends. And when you look at Texas, what's so amazing about the 2024 election in Texas is that the suburbs of Dallas and Houston, which were really ground zero for the Ronald Reagan Republican Party, they're now blue, or at least light blue. And then you look at South Texas, which the Democrats historically won by just extraordinary margins, they're now red, county after county along the Rio Grande. And so it feels to me like this is an even more profound divide than we've seen historically, because class is so fundamental to people's sense of well-being, and that is also playing a role in undermining our sense of democratic legitimacy, and that sense that the other side poses a dire threat to our way of life, in either direction. So I'd just be curious about your response to that.
I think you're right. I think the diploma divide, as it's called, is sort of striking when you look at the data. And you're right, say the college educated, largely white liberal voters prefer the Democratic Party by an enormous margin, and working class voters are increasingly migrating to the Republican Party. So I think it's a little premature to label this a sort of partisan realignment, but it's possible that it will turn into that. And the reason I'm hesitant to sort of say that yet is because I just think these are very complicated political times. I think Trump is, sort of a very unique political character in many ways. And so I just think we need to have some distance to see what happens in subsequent elections before asserting that there's been an actual realignment on the scale of what, we'd say happened in 1932 or something. But nevertheless, these are interesting trends, and they are trends. It has not just been one election, right? It's been over 2 presidential cycles now. So this follows on what Ned was getting at. This presents profound challenges, particularly for the Democratic Party, to think about how to brand itself, what its messaging should be. You see internal dissension, right, about whether the party should tack more to the left. The wisdom at the moment, right, is that was the error of recent years, and the party should have been more focused on appealing to the, quote unquote, median voter. Not a coincidence, right, that you're seeing a lot of profiles at the moment of people like Abigail Spanberger, right, who's actually been vocal on this, running for, governor of Virginia, and has said expressly the party was too left, right? The party should have been focused on, again, to Ned's question, what's happening in communities like in Virginia, right, where people, you know, are concerned with, you know, kitchen table issues, not as concerned with identity politics-based issues. So we'll see if that perspective wins out party-wide, but I think that those efforts are underway. And, you know, Texas, it's interesting. I mean, it's true that these shifts are happening in South Texas. Again, it's been more than just one election now. It's been 2 election cycles. When you look at the reasons for that, it's fascinating. You know, there's a lot of different variables. So I hesitate to sort of say anything. I don't want anything to be taken categorically. But some of that is much of it has to do with jobs, right? And the belief about, you know, who is providing oil, gas, and energy jobs in those regions, right? And the Hispanic communities that rely on those jobs, right? Some of it can be explained just by the belief that moving to a green energy economy was going to eliminate those jobs that this community relies on. So sometimes it's that straightforward. Because I think for a lot of people on the left, you say, well, how could the Hispanic community support Donald Trump given all he's said and done? That's, according to some reporting I've seen, that partially explains it. That's not going to explain what's happening in other parts of the country. So we need to sort of look community by community in order to understand these things. And so again, these grand narratives, I think are, they're tempting, and some of them get pushed by, you know, big papers like the New York Times and Washington Post. But my tendency is always to try to wait a bit and gather some more evidence or information before drawing any conclusions, particularly in the wake of a presidential election where, you know, there's all this sort of, you know, there's a tendency to do all these diagnoses in the months after. And typically we find out that our initial hunches or assumptions weren't quite right.
Well, maybe that's a good place to pause the conversation. I mean, we will keep collecting evidence. We will keep seeing where these kinds of issues go, much as we'd like to tie them all up right now and have more definitive results, but we don't. But I'll say this has been another really interesting extension on the symposium last week, and we really are appreciative, Joshua, of you spending this time with us again today, in addition to being part of the event last week. So thank you very much. And it's always great to be with you, Ned, and Terry, and Tony. And I look forward to another episode of our podcast coming soon. For now, thank you and be well.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.